Picture a smoky backstage dressing room filled with bright lights and a sense of electric anticipation. The sort of hidden sanctuary where someone like Meg Miles could slip into a daring costume, reapply her lipstick, and step out with a mischievous gleam in her eye. Now imagine you're watching her from the wings, trying to figure out how she became this boundary-pushing, rule-breaking phenomenon whose name popped up in glossy magazine columns and hushed showbiz gossip, but who never quite ended up enshrined in standard Hollywood lore. This is Meg Miles, the unconventional performer who straddled two worlds, one of glitzy stardom, another of fearless self-expression, and who refused to bend her persona to fit anyone else's vision. She is the smoky club singer who laughed in the face of censorship, the rebellious soul who hopped from city to city, and the woman who left behind an inimitable legacy when she passed away at 84. Let's dive into her story and discover how a small-town girl turned into a fearless icon who consistently turned up the heat wherever she went, scorching the boundaries of polite entertainment to forge her own distinctive style. Meg Miles was born in Seattle in 1934, growing up under the watchful eye of a father who was a World War II veteran known for his no-nonsense discipline. Yet even from her earliest days, Meg teemed with a restlessness that outgrew her modest home. She craved a bigger stage, a wider audience, something grander than her day-to-day routine. In high school, when she joined community theater, people instantly saw the spark. She had a presence that screamed, "Watch me." Her lively confidence and striking looks were magnets for attention, signs that she might be destined for something beyond the constraints of her Seattle upbringing. It wasn't long before Meg decided to uproot herself and chase bigger dreams. In the early 1950s, she left behind everything she knew, heading off to New York City with a suitcase and the faint promise that something more exciting was out there. She landed a job as a secretary typing documents from 9 to 5, but her heart was never in it. She'd glance at Manhattan's bright lights, the hustle of Broadway, and think, "Why am I stuck in an office?" Fortune found her when a talent scout spotted her on a crowded street. In a city teeming with aspiring models and actresses, Meg's distinctive aura could not be ignored. When asked to pose for a test shoot, she didn't hesitate. Soon enough, photographers were enthralled by her dramatic, almost provocative style. She perfected the art of giving the camera a look that was half angel, half dare, and it paid off. Her face began appearing in minor print ads, slowly fueling a small ripple of public curiosity. But as her modeling career escalated, Meg started craving more than just still photographs. She wanted movement, stories, and the electric charge of an audience. Thus began her foray into the world of burlesque. The moment she stepped onto that stage, wearing flamboyant costumes and a confident grin, she knew she'd found a truer calling. Burlesque was all about defying stifling expectations and embracing the tantalizing side of performance. It gave her the rush she'd never found in bland photo shoots or polite fashion shows. Her acts merged elegance with a rebellious streak, an unstoppable cocktail that left audiences both stunned and enthralled. She adopted a stage name, but that flamboyant presence was entirely Meg, bold, unashamed, and ready to provoke the mainstream. She proved to be so magnetic that every night clubs would fill with people eager to see what boundary she might push next. Her flamboyant feather outfits, her teasing comedic bits with the audience, none of it would have flown in safe Hollywood circles, but in the smoky realm of burlesque, it was pure gold. That rebellious side naturally drew the attention of risk-takers in entertainment. By the late 1950s, Meg found herself dabbling in film roles. Hollywood had conflicting feelings about her. Her allure was undeniable, so producers offered her parts, but they also worried about her reputation, A woman this unafraid to test boundaries might be too raw for big studios that craved squeaky clean starlets. And so the story repeated itself in frustrating cycles. She'd get cast, the cameras would roll, but the moment her unfiltered style came out, the studio would panic. Scenes got watered down, toned down, or removed entirely. It was as though they'd wanted the sizzle that came with her name, but not the actual flame. Meg could only laugh at the hypocrisy. She'd once told a friend that Hollywood beckoned her with open arms, then tried to smother the very spark that brought her there. Censorship battles hounded her right from the start. One particular scandal erupted in 1959. She was cast in a film specifically for her confident mystique, but once executives realized that Meg's version of confidence didn't align with their ideal of a respectable leading lady, they attempted to mold her into something more palatable. They cut out segments of her scenes, insisted on reining in her flamboyant wardrobe, and even revised lines to dial down her outspoken persona. Meg bristled. She saw the contradiction. "We want you because you're unique, but please stop being so unique." Another confrontation about a costume design only escalated the tension. She'd arrived on set with an outfit that was a bit more risque, reminiscent of her burlesque flair. Studio executives panicked, forcing her to change into something more traditionally ladylike. Every time they clamped down on her style, Meg felt suffocated, certain that these fights were about more than just a piece of clothing. They were about her freedom to express herself. Still, she wasn't one to wilt under censorship. Every time Hollywood tried to muzzle her, she pushed back, sometimes quietly, sometimes flamboyantly. She staged a now infamous photo shoot in 1962 that hammered this point home. Wearing one of her burlesque-inspired outfits, all feathers, barely their fabric, and that brand of seductive wink that had become her signature, she posed for a reputable magazine. The editors balked when they saw the shots, deeming them inappropriate, and refused to publish them. Meg wasn't deterred. Instead, she marched onto a popular radio show and vented, albeit tactfully, about the industry's hypocrisy and double standards. She didn't name names, but everyone knew precisely which corners of Hollywood she was calling out. In a world where studios demanded docile compliance from actresses, her outspokenness was practically a revolution. Audiences ate it up. Perhaps they were hungry for a star who wasn't going to spout PR cliches. Public stunts became Meg's specialty. One time, she showed up uninvited at a major film festival in a gown so form-fitting that tabloids buzzed about it for days. Some journalists assumed she was pulling a publicity stunt. Others speculated it was just typical Meg being Meg. Either way, she dominated the headlines. She understood that if Hollywood's gatekeepers wanted to keep a tight leash on her, she'd circumvent them, harnessing the power of spectacle on her own terms. These strategies weren't just petty grabs for attention. They were declarations that she, not the studios, controlled how she was seen. She had studied Hollywood's PR game and knew how to beat them at it. But her story wasn't solely one of rebellious glitz. Meg Miles was also a woman with a personal life that was as tempestuous and thrilling as her career. She floated in and out of high-profile relationships, with tabloids devoting entire columns to her romances. One longtime love interest was a famous jazz musician, known for his own penchant for living on the edge. They'd frequent late-night clubs together, embodying a romantic spark that the press found irresistible. Their link to the experimental jazz scene gave Meg an additional layer of mystique, a rebellious burlesque star, and a moody jazz savant, swirling through smoky clubs with an entourage of beat poets and free-spirited artists. Perhaps in that creative realm, Meg found a kind of kinship. She was naturally drawn to communities that thrived on breaking norms. whether those norms were about music, politics, or sexuality. It wasn't just jazz circles she got tangled up in. She was friends with avant-garde theater directors, painters who specialized in controversial artwork, and even political firebrands who'd garnered a fair share of enemies in the mainstream. Rumors swirled that she had connections to certain clandestine advocacy groups, or that she'd used her public platform to push subversive ideas. While she never addressed these rumors directly, her silence only added fuel to the speculation. Was she secretly funneling Hollywood money to radical thinkers, or hobnobbing with covert political figures? The truth remains murky, but the swirling intrigue only sharpened her rebel image. She embraced folks for who they were, not for their popularity or acceptance, and that disinterest in proper alliances made her personal circle a curiosity to outsiders. As if constantly pushing showbiz boundaries wasn't enough, she had a well-known track record of defying cultural norms, too. One time, she boycotted a glitzy industry event after discovering the venue's discriminatory admission policies. In an era when activism among celebrities was not as embraced as it is today, this stance was a bold move. Studio executives were furious, telling her to keep quiet and attend, but she refused, telling them flatly she wouldn't support a place that excluded people. Such moves did cost her roles. Producers prefer their stars to smile, nod, and do as they're told. Yet Meg saw these momentary hits to her career as a price worth paying for her integrity. She was forging her path, unmindful of gatekeepers who wanted docility. Meanwhile, her travels became legendary among close friends. Though her stardom might have faded some by the early 1970s, she found new vitality by escaping to foreign locales. She'd slip away to Europe for months at a time, immersing herself in local art scenes and forging bonds with underground playwrights or bohemian artists who didn't care one bit about the Hollywood brand. People who traveled with her recalled nights of laughter and deep conversation, of Meg showing up to a roadside cafe in an impossibly chic outfit that somehow fit perfectly with the laid-back environment. She'd saunter into these tiny towns, glean inspiration from their music or poetry, and possibly share a little of her own unstoppable spirit with them. She once hopped onto a spontaneous road trip down the Amalfi Coast with a group of local Italians, an impromptu adventure that underscored her love for spontaneity and real human connection. Arriving in the midst of the Tropicalia movement in 1967, Meg soaked up the frenetic, colorful energy of the local music and art. She'd attend concerts incognito, letting the pulsing rhythms and fearless creative ethos wash over her. One might see her dancing among the crowd, not as an American star, but as a fellow traveler enthralled by the mesmerizing swirl of cultural revolution. She didn't trumpet these experiences to the press. They were private, a respite from the constant scrutiny back home. In those hidden corners of the world, she found new ways to feed her creative hunger, new experiences that reaffirmed her desire to live life unbound by mainstream expectations. By the time the 1970s rolled in, her time in the Hollywood spotlight had mostly receded. Roles were scarcer, and the industry was spotlighting new, younger faces. Many might call that a downward spiral, but Meg treated it as a release. After 2 furious decades of battling censorship and feuding with studios, she was ready for a different kind of existence. Returning to New York, she found comfort in smaller, more intimate theater productions. Off-Broadway plays let her step into characters that resonated with her personal ethos: women on the brink of transformation, or rebellious souls who defied society's scripts. She even toyed with writing, infusing her characters with her own brand of fierce independence, weaving in themes like resilience and self-empowerment. These productions never became top-billed hits, but for Meg, they offered a sense of genuine fulfillment that mainstream stardom never gave. She also channeled her energy into mentoring and charity work. Gone was the woman who once walked red carpets in outlandish gowns to get a headline. Now, she was forging real connections with up-and-coming performers and young women who needed someone to boost their confidence. If her earlier public stance on issues of equality had rubbed some folks the wrong way, these philanthropic efforts highlighted the depth of her convictions. She once said that helping someone find their sense of worth felt more significant than starring in 100 movies. She might have been saying it lightheartedly, but friends insisted she meant every word. For a star once known for flamboyant outfits and rowdy midnight performances, her life quietly shifted toward authenticity over attention. She never officially quit show business. She merely let it fade into her peripheral vision. Family and friends described her later years as peaceful, even serene, though she never lost the spark that made her special. She was still Meg Miles, opinionated, vibrant, and fiercely alive, just without the constant glare of a camera lens. Those who truly want the full, unvarnished story, though, would have to read her unpublished memoirs. Sometime in her slower period, Meg took to writing it all down. The early days in Burlesque, the sly ways she eluded Hollywood's censors, the romance with that jazz musician whose name the tabloids loved to exploit. She refused to airbrush the rough edges. Friends who glimpsed the manuscript described it as frank, surprisingly raunchy in places, but also deeply introspective. It recounted not just the triumphs, but the predatory behavior she encountered along the way, producers who propositioned her, industry insiders who tried to make her conform. People say that if it ever sees the light of day, we'll see a version of Meg Miles that goes even beyond the rebellious public persona. It'll be a portrait of a woman who burned the rulebook and stared down the consequences. When the 1980s dawned, a new wave of Hollywood glossed over many old-school rebels like Meg. Blockbusters churned out squeaky clean stars again, and society's tastes pivoted. Yet she remained a name that people whispered about if they'd frequented certain circles. The actress who had once danced at the Latin Quarter, the woman who told powerful producers to shove their double standards, the traveler who let the wild nights of Brazil's music scene seep into her soul. Occasionally, she'd show up in ephemeral underground film projects, cameo roles in avant-garde pieces that almost no one outside niche festivals ever saw. And in each cameo, she exuded a rawness that no big-budget production could replicate. Those roles were her way of staying connected to the art she truly cared about, the type that refused to be sanitized or mass-produced. By the 1990s, she was effectively absent from the mainstream. She spent her time in a New York apartment that became a safe harbor for a peculiar circle of creative misfits and ex-Hollywood types who shared her distaste for the formulaic industry machine. These gatherings, though small and private, were legendary in their own right. Attendees spoke of late-night philosophical debates about the meaning of performance art, the tangling of activism and entertainment, the cost of forging your own path in a world that tries to box you in at every turn, and Meg, never shy, gladly offered her take. She had no regrets, she'd say. She'd performed on her own terms. She'd lived out loud. One last cameo emerged in the late 1970s with an avant-garde director, a short black and white film that screened at underground festivals. Her role was uncredited, but those who saw it said she still commanded the screen. No fancy costumes this time, no comedic phone prop illusions, just Meg in a bare-bones environment, delivering lines with understated power. And in those fleeting minutes, you could see how, Even as the world moved on, her gift hadn't dimmed. Meg's final years were shaped by smaller joys and a sense of contentment. She spent time traveling to reunite with old friends who, like her, had departed from the glitzy swirl. Sometimes they'd swap war stories about censorship battles or reflect on how drastically the entertainment business had shifted. She no longer chased the spotlight, but the people around her said she still had that comedic glint in her eye, that intangible aura that once transfixed thousands from a stage. On November 12, 2019, Meg Miles died just 2 days shy of her 85th birthday. To say that her passing slipped under the radar might be accurate in mainstream terms, but those who knew her or admired her rebellious spirit mourned the loss of a legend. She'd been so many things: a defiant burlesque performer, a sporadic Hollywood actress who refused to wear society's muzzle, a bohemian traveler, an outspoken voice for equality, a friend to the most unconventional of souls, and possibly the only woman who could upstage an entire film festival simply by walking in. It's unclear whether her memoirs will ever reach public hands. Perhaps they'll remain locked away in a box somewhere, the raw testament to a life thoroughly lived, sprinkled with details the public might never get to see. But even if they stay hidden, her story resonates. She exemplifies a brand of performer that stands outside the lines, ignoring the boundaries that a conformist industry draws. She refused to let conservative attitudes define her, consistently reminding the world that real artistry and real living happens when we take risks, speak our minds, and savor each moment of genuine freedom. In a world that often romanticizes only the success stories, Meg Miles reminds us that the greatest characters sometimes exist in the margins, forging an untamed path all their own. She rejected roles that tamed her essence, criticized the double standards that demanded she tone down her flamboyance, and told predators in power to step off. She traveled the globe in search of fresh inspiration, mingling with progressive circles that fed her appetite for authenticity. She curated a network of like-minded souls who saw no need to abide by Hollywood's stiff protocols. And even if her name didn't appear on the typical greatest stars lists, her cult following of admirers saw her as the real deal, somebody who never apologized for wanting to see how far she could push a performance. Somewhere in that tension between brazen defiance and earnest creativity, Meg Miles carved out a place in entertainment history that no one else could claim. She was the star who plucked feathers from a flamboyant costume to fling them at the prudes, the outspoken actress who refused to sugarcoat her beliefs, the bohemian traveler who danced to bossa nova rhythms in a faraway club at 3 a.m., the unstoppable icon who walked away from the big screen on her own terms and never begged for a comeback. She lived life fully. If you wanted to join her for the ride, you'd better be able to keep up with the intensity of her spirit. Though her passing may have gone relatively unannounced by modern media, her story endures for those who dig deeper, beyond the polished Hollywood narratives. She defied the mold as a burlesque dancer, a boundary-pushing star, an unapologetic lover, and an artist who thrived in the electric hum of rebellion. That's the real Meg Miles, a woman who leaned into every moment, unafraid to pay the price for her defiance, convinced that the fleeting thrill of authenticity was better than a sanitized life of compliance. And so, if you ever see a grainy black and white photo of her, feathered costume glittering under stage lights, or stumble across a fleeting cameo in an obscure film, remember the roaring applause, the hush of audience breath as she teased them with comedic flair and fearless sensuality, and that unstoppable voice that refused to let the system break her. This is the legacy she left behind, an enduring invitation to embrace spontaneity, to question outdated norms, and to celebrate the wildness that good art, real courage, and a little bit of mischief can bring. Meg Miles is gone, but her spirit lingers in every rebel who dares to put on a show that doesn't fit in a neat little box, who travels the world on a whim, and who never compromises on that essential spark that makes life worth living. So let her be a reminder. There's magic in defiance, wonder in deviance, and an unquenchable thrill in forging your own path, no matter who might want to label you too risque, too outspoken, too unapologetically yourself.